me today are two experts in the security space, broad-based in cybersecurity, physical security, corporate security. One of the two is Mark Freedman. Mark is the CEO of Rebel Global Security. And among other things, he was the chief of staff in the Bureau of Counterterrorism at the State Department. And someone I haven't connected with in quite a while, but we had a history way back when we were both doing some work with the banking industry. Rick Mercuri. Rick, longtime security expert with a number of major corporate security roles at large and mid-sized banks. He now does consulting both for Rebel Global Security as well as his own LLC. So, Rick and Mark, thank you so much for taking the time. And Mark, I should mention you and I have done a previous podcast, so I appreciate you joining me again. And Rick, of course, it's been a long time, but thanks again for sitting in on this today.
Certainly.
Good to be here. Thanks, John.
What we want to talk about today is physical security, security of workplaces, security for executives, for others from companies in terms of issues like workplace violence. Obviously, we've seen a number of violent acts in the U.S. against corporate individuals. You know, the most famous so far that everybody knows about was the murder of the CEO of United Healthcare late last year, and Rick has done some analysis of that going forward. But Rick, let's start off with this. Many of our listeners are from the financial sector, not all, but many are, and so the notion of physical security protection for banks. Talk a bit about that in 2025.
Sure. Certainly I think right now the financial services industry, like many other industries, within this kind of heightened threat environment, physical security threat environment across the banking industry is unlike anything we've seen in recent decades. And at some point, every bank and every organization will become victim or be impacted in one way or another by crime. Typical bank-related crimes such as robberies and burglaries will always continue to be there. They'll always be occurring periodically. Although in recent years we've seen a significant reduction in those types of crimes, particularly bank robbery, the traditional bank robbery. Still very serious, but again, we're just not seeing that frequency. That's the good news. The bad news is regarding ATMs. ATM attacks remain a serious concern, and those include things like hook and chain attacks, malware attacks, service team robberies. These are largely increasing across the U.S. They're mainly geographically located. However, they are spreading into new geographies as well. And going back, during the dark days of COVID, banks have seen an increase in disruptive and violent behavior occurring within their branches. And not just banks, but a lot of retail organizations that are customer facing have seen this kind of surge in these types of incidents that occur, whether it be irate customers that begin to act irrationally and violently, or individuals just walking off the street, particularly in urban environments. And these oftentimes result in not only a disruption of business, damage to the facility, but also injury and even sometimes death of customers or employees. In addition, we have political tensions that are quite obvious right now: rising extremism, political polarization is a big concern, and the threat of civil unrest. And as well as the ever-present active shooter type situations that are occurring across the U.S. And these are front and center for any security leader that's out there. These are now threats. There's no single thing that's keeping a security leader awake at night. It's a bunch of things, and we're covering them now. And we now look back, towards the end of last year. We had the murder of the United Healthcare executive, Brian Thompson. And this opened up an entirely new question around executive security. Executive security is now front and center for a lot of large organizations. Pretty much all organizations have begun to drive towards enhancing their programs. And then last but not least, you had the deadly mass shooting that occurred at 345 Park Avenue in New York back in July. And this further exposed vulnerabilities to physical security controls. So again, all of those controls that we've had in place for a number of years, all of a sudden, we were exposed. We had an incident that occurred, and basically it caused security leaders to go back now and really reevaluate the technologies that they're using and some of the things that we can do to help mitigate crimes like that happen suddenly, spur of the moment, unexpected. And these are some of the concerns. So that's a little bit of a highlight as to what I consider being the kind of heightened threat environment as we sit today.
So yeah, so I'll go to you in a second, Mark. So we're talking both about planned attacks by potentially more than one person. Obviously, individual lone shooters, that happens quite a bit. We also have seen attacks on government buildings. We've had this week, as we're recording, the shooting in Dallas at the ICE facility. We also saw the shooting at CDC in Atlanta. Obviously, there's also a prolific amount of guns out there, but we can't solve that problem today. So I think it's both a question of the physical security of the institution, whether the institution is a physical building or at a conference like it was with United Healthcare, but in what Rick just mentioned, the protection of executives and others. So, Mark, what are other things we should think about as we dive into this today?
Well, I think, John, I would highlight, just to build off of one of Rick's points, the way in which we've seen a bit of a paradigm shift around these issues since the United Healthcare murder. And really in the way that companies and individuals think about what is physical security, what is executive protection, what is corporate security. They've always been of amorphous concepts that every company treats in their own way to a certain extent. But I think the United Healthcare murder it has really brought executive protection to the fore. And that has created questions around, well, do we have an executive protection program? Do we have a physical security program? Do we have both of those things? How are they interrelated? And I think, for those of us who are in the space, we see the linkages between those things, and we understand that in order to have strong executive protection, you need strong physical security, and vice versa, right? But for those who are less familiar with corporate security, I think there can be a tendency to say, well, we saw the United Healthcare murder. We see a steady drumbeat of targeted assassinations and attempted assassinations. And so let's just get a security detail for the executive, right? And that is that kind of like knee-jerk reactive response that really does not do a whole lot to solve the problem holistically. And so that's just kind of a trend I'd note that we've seen, especially through this year of 2025, as companies and the industry tries to figure out, where do we go from here?
Rick, let's do this. Let's assume I'm a brand new company, maybe a new bank, and I reach out to both of you and I say, we have no experience of previous violent acts. Wherever we're going to be located, let's say for purposes of the example, we're not in an urban area, but we're in an area outside of a city, and we come to you guys and we say, can you build us a program? So we want you sort of soup to nuts. We want you to both protect our senior leadership, but we want you to protect our staff. Talk a bit about, let's say they're actually going to a new building? What's the technology that they should think about? What's the process? To Mark's point, you don't want to just get a security detail. You want to make it much broader than that. So start us off. I walked into you, a Rebel Global Security. I said, help me craft this from the ground up. What are some of the things you want to actively consider?
Well, I think the first thing is absolutely essential, and that's understanding what the threat is. To get there, it requires very in-depth analysis around the threat. So a threat intelligence analysis of some form needs to take place, looking across the entire landscape. So first starting off at looking at the organization. Are there any threats that are current that they're aware of? But also, are there other things that they're not quite aware of at this point? That could be, the type of business it is. Are they involved in any controversial activities?
Right.
The leadership. Who are the leadership that they're trying to protect? Are there leaders within the organization who are vulnerable by way of perhaps involvement in political organizations? Again, controversial type activities. As well as their exposure as leaders. They're out there in the media, especially during today's climate, where we saw what happened with the United Healthcare CEO, where all of a sudden there were people celebrating his murder. So these are the types of things that need to be part of that threat assessment. And then what has to be looked at next is their vulnerability. How are they vulnerable within that organization, not just in the workplace, but at home, during travel, right across the full spectrum. So all of that has to be analyzed first before we can really get into the program as a whole.
How tough is it, Mark, to sell all of what Rick just mentioned to a newly formed, going back to my example of a bank? So it's just a typical, let's say a little bigger than a community bank, let's say a mid-sized bank, a banker's bank, or an individual traditional bank. Because I know a few folks that I've worked with are creating banks, and you want to go in there, and to Rick's point, you got to figure out, but maybe nobody in leadership is involved in politics. Maybe it's sort of a traditional institution with just basic loans and checking accounts, that kind of stuff. But you still want them to have protection. How do you sell that? How do you tell them, look, there's been no examples of these issues. This particular geographic area maybe doesn't have a history of issues in the past, but you still want to be protected. What are some of the ways in which you raise their awareness?
That's a great question, John. And there are so many things going through my mind right now. I think the first thing I would say is that, unfortunately, in many cases, you don't sell them. Because if I have to go into an organization and make the case that they should really start thinking about security issues more seriously and invest money in it, and that's the starting point for the conversation,
Right.
I'm not making a sale that day. We get customers as a result of incidents that have happened typically to those businesses, or something has happened to a business in the sector, and they've realized that it's time to take a fresh look at this. And I will say, we have, in some cases, not gotten customers because we will only go through this kind of soup to nuts process that Rick is describing. Okay, so for the type of organization or bank that you're describing, and it's funny, I'm like, what you were saying, we've heard, right? The common refrain of, we don't have any issues, nobody's going to be out there to target us, we just want we want the basic, we want the basic package, don't worry about it too much, it's going to be, and that's like totally antithetical to what we do for a living, right? First of all, and we can't in good conscience provide that to a customer, right? No matter how safe you think you are or how few risks you think may impact you, what you need to do to build a program, like Rick said, is you have to have either yourself or you have a consultant look at that threat environment and build the program based on that. So I would just say, yeah, that there's not too much that we can do to lead a horse to water on that. These companies, they get to a point where they realize they need somebody to take a look at it.
That's fair. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. One of the case studies, Rick, on the Rebel Global Security's website talks high level about the challenge that one particular client had because there were multiple violent security incidents, and then they brought you folks in, and then after conducting a physical security assessment, intelligence assessment, things that you've already alluded to, Rick, you gave them close to 90 recommendations. I'm not going to ask you to repeat 90 recommendations, but besides what you've already mentioned, and I'll prejudice one of your partially your answer with this. I remember back when you and I were still doing work for the bankers. One of the issues, this was more about bank robbery than it was protection, but there was this debate among all of you that I would listen to whether you should have an armed guard, number one, that was an issue. Whether you should have an armed guard outside the bank or inside the bank. And that's how seemingly simplistic the debate was back then. So I always found that fascinating because it was actually a pretty robust debate. I mean, whoever side you were on, they felt really strongly about their position, and whether there was metrics behind it or anecdotal examples. But talk a bit about some of the recommendations, like you just said, you would give to an institution that clearly had multiple violent incidents. To Mark's point, you don't just want a security detail. Talk a bit about some of the things that have to be considered, both physical to the institution. Does it impact cameras and elevators and front desk support? Talk about some of those things, and because you guys have a lot of experience in offering that up to clients.
All right. When it comes to preventing specific incidents at a specific site, and again, we'll use say a bank branch as an example. That's a fairly simple, straightforward event that occurs. That could be anything from customers being attacked to bank robbery. And so using bank robbery as an example, first of all, it starts with a risk assessment again, understanding the risks, what's the likelihood of it occurring, because you have to look at all of your branches across the footprint. Certainly history could say that it happens most often at this particular branch, but that can change. Bank robbers tend to move around a lot, so they have to look at that holistically. When it comes to the preventative measures, there's so many things that can be done. And you talked about guards, for example, and that, by the way, that argument still rages today as far as placement of guards. I'm a proponent of keeping them outside and very visible, even with a very visible uniform. But that's one thing that can be done. Other things that can be looked at is protecting the employees. And that's the number one, employees and customers, actually. That's the number one priority, is protection of life. So, we would recommend things such as the use of ballistic glass at the front entrances that would prevent someone from shooting their way into a branch or smashing their way with a blunt object. So either ballistic glass or some kind of security film. These are some of the things that we would recommend. Visible cameras. It's great to have cameras. I think they're essential. But it's also good to make sure that they're visible, even exterior cameras. A lot of banks do not use exterior cameras, but that's a deterrent as well. You want to make it a very hard target for robbers to select. And that's really what it's all about. Awareness. And one of the big things is surveillance and intelligence. And that goes all the way to the employees that work in the branch to be able to always constantly have their head on a swivel and looking out for suspicious activity. Someone coming in to potentially case the branch prior to a robbery, suspicious vehicles. If there are guards on premise, making sure that they're trained to do this. and to be able to report back what their findings very, very rapidly. So these are some of the things that we would recommend. And again, it would be risk-based. We wouldn't recommend all these things. There's die packs and everything. We wouldn't recommend that for every single branch. If you have 100 branches, that's a lot of money. Again, these would be for your high-risk branches. So again, it's important to have a risk assessment methodology in place before you make these decisions.
I know that you guys provide advice and counsel to a whole host of different businesses, and Rick mentioned earlier the shootings in Manhattan. I was at a money laundering conference 5 or 6 years ago, and instead of some of the typical keynote, they had somebody from law enforcement do an active shooter drill for it wasn't a big group, but like 100 of us or whatever. Not something I'd seen before. Obviously, schools do that now, and other places. Where does that fit in, if at all? Is that typically something, as you were saying before, Mark, that happens after there's been an event? Because that's not necessarily something. Let's talk about a business that's pretty large. Obviously, I'm not talking about a branch with 10 people, although obviously everybody could benefit from some awareness of that. But in like a larger, law firm, advisory group, or a financial institution, when would that be something you would say, hey, look, in addition to everything else, since you've had some issues here, an active shooter drill would be useful as well?
Well, I'll just say, and then I'll turn it over to Rick because he's better to answer this than I am. But that would be part of, again, ideally a broad training and awareness program, right? And so everything that we do, we're always looking at. Don't just have this one-off response that says, okay, there was an active shooter incident, last week that we heard about in the news. So get those active shooter training guys in here to do a drill at the conference, right? Instead, it should be part of a broader training program that's tailored to the organization, the threat profile, the needs of the employees, and all of that. But let me turn it over to Rick because he's the one who designs this kind of stuff.
Yeah, Rick, your thoughts?
Yeah, so Mark's spot on, and it's very broad. There's a lot of things that should happen. And let me focus on one thing, and it has to do with modern age here, where we're at technology-wise. The world is changing, technology's changing. As security leaders, people need to look. They need to begin to look at every single way possible to prevent these types of incidents from happening. They're very difficult to prevent. And the Park Ave situation was a good example of that. They need to start looking at the technologies, particularly things like AI and how AI can integrate into the broader security ecosystem, the security system ecosystem within the organization. So for example, using Park Ave as an example, we all saw the photos of the suspect walking into the facility, walking up the walkway with a long gun. That's a threat. That's highly unusual. The video cameras picked it up. Now, and again, I'm talking kind of pie in the sky here, but it's an example. If using AI perhaps could inform all of the other security systems to react, because human reaction takes a long time. You're not going to be able to react in time. So for an example, if once that CCTV system captured the long weapon approaching the building, it would automatically lock down the front doors, lock down the elevators. So now you're protecting the entire rest of the building. The lobby could still be at risk, unless, of course, they have BR glass, bullet-resistant glass. So this is the type of technology that we need to start to think about. How can we integrate it and improve our current security environment through that technology? All of the other things that Mark mentioned previous to me getting on this little bit of a spiel, I think is very, very important. You have to look at the overall program. You have to look at the training, the awareness, the intelligence. Again, everything going back to the intelligence. Are there things going on in these organizations that have heightened the threat? So you could have a situation of a corporate downsizing. That's a huge threat. You're laying off 150 people, 1,000 people, whatever that number, and people are angry. So these are the things that you need to prepare for and take decisive action before an event occurs.
Let me just add one point on that, on the Park Ave shooting in particular. Look, we have not done a deep dive on the Park Ave shooting. We have not examined all of the the documentation and the blueprints and whatever. So you have to kind of caveat it with that. That being said, I saw a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking after the Park Ave shooting about, well, if they had had this type of access control or this sort of technology, then it could have done X. That was a highly secured building, just from the little that I've been able to glean.
Sure.
And when an armed assailant comes in with an assault rifle, you could have the best security systems, technologies program in the world, and you still may not be able to prevent all harm from occurring. And that is an inconvenient truth that I think it's hard for people to wrap their mind around right now when the threat environment is as bad as it is, because the threat environment is just really bad right now. And so I would just mention that because I think in our business, I saw some stuff on LinkedIn that was like, if a security consultant had been in there and, they should have identified X, Y, and Z. I mean, it's a human business. And I would just say, kind of for the other security consultants out there, you do your best to provide the recommendations and the advice to a client to improve their program, but there's never a guarantee that something like this is going to be completely prevented. And I think that's something that the industry as a whole and corporates they need to grapple with that.
Yeah, that's such a fair point, because how often do we see second and third guessing when someone has posted something on social media as they're about to commit a violent act, and we should have seen that. Really? I mean, how many people are watching everybody's social media feeds? And sometimes if it's going to friends and neighbors, it's not as if people are sitting there checking everything in real time. So I think that's unfair. Rick's point, which I hadn't thought about, but it's so obvious, when there's downsizing and elimination of staff, another area, obviously, that's when security should be stepped up, just in case, because as Rick said, people are angry. This is an area that is continuing to challenge all of us, because that's happening not just in the government, but in the private sector as well. We have a couple minutes left. I want to get some takeaways from both of you. But Mark, let me start with you. Talk a little bit about your group, the work you've done. Like I said, you were kind enough to sit down with me a bit ago. Obviously, it's things in the cybersecurity space and others, but talk a bit about Rebel Global, and then give us one additional takeaway from today, and then I'll go to Rick for final thoughts.
Yeah, well, I mean, not to beat a dead horse here, John, but I mean, really, the reason that we were set up the way that we are was to provide clients with a more holistic view of security issues, geopolitical issues, national security issues, and I think in the threat environment and the incidents that we see occurring, whether it's the United Healthcare murder, the Park Ave incident, the attempted assassinations of President Trump, the Charlie Kirk assassination recently, you can see how all of these issues are interrelated, right? Physical security, executive protection, cybersecurity, political violence, geopolitical issues. And it's important for companies to find ways to wrap their minds, their collective minds, around all of those issues, and build programs that are comprehensive and can get at all of those issues, which is just traditionally not the way that it's been done, right? Most corporations are highly stovepiped in the way that they treat these different issues. So that would be my plug at the end, is that especially as we see the threats increasing in the way that they are, it's important for companies to try to take that broad view and make real institutional change to be able to keep up with that environment as it changes so rapidly.
Yeah, I noticed that there was, when the murders of those Minnesota legislators occurred in their own homes, there was a response from the Minnesota legislature to add security, not just when they're in session, but at home. And that's the same thing that you saw with the attack on Paul Pelosi at Nancy Pelosi's house. It's really hard to have security everywhere, obviously, but you have to make, to your guys' point, a threat and risk assessment and make a decision, especially now, as Rick has pointed out, given the environment we're in, you're subject to potential violence everywhere. So it becomes really hard to figure out where to spend the resources and time. So awareness seems to be the key after you've determined what the risks are. Final thoughts from you, Rick?
Yeah, I would say another very important piece to this, to protecting people, protecting organizations, is to ensure that your security program is appropriately scaled. Not only being holistic, as Mark pointed out, and covering all aspects, but also that you have the proper staffing. You have the proper numbers of people, but also the talent. You need that expertise in specific areas now. The days of the security generalist are gone. There are very specific disciplines within security now that people can focus on or must focus on in order to be successful. So organizations really need to look at the security program. Once they kind of develop the written program, they really need to understand what it's going to take to execute that program and the talent needed.
Rick Mercuri, Mark Freedman, thank you so much. rebelglobalsecurity.com is the website. There's links to articles that Rick has authored. There's also links to case studies and other information. Guys, I really appreciate this. I'd like to say I hope we don't have to have updates, but sadly, that's probably going to be the case. But I urge everybody paying attention today to, rethink their security protocols and security training and security policies. I think it's important that they do that if they haven't already considered that. So thank you, guys. Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John.